Today's forum will be given by Shauna-Kay Harrison, Alfred University digital archivist, who will tell us today about the life of a digital archivist. Take it away, Shauna-Kay.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Yes? Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Shauna-Kay Harrison, and I am the digital archivist for AU Libraries. I am semi-new. This coming August, it will be 2 years since I've been at AU. And throughout my time here, I've been learning about our collections and just thinking about ways to share them further. And as I've met people around campus, many have asked me what my role entails. So I thought I'd use a Bergren Forum just to give you all a glimpse into what I do and to show what goes into preserving AU's digital history. Before I start, I want to emphasize that this is a very broad overview of digital archiving, so I won't be going into the nitty-gritty of day-to-day tasks, which would be extremely boring, trust me, but rather discussing the considerations digital archivists have to take into account and how these considerations overlap and differ from those traditional archivists have to think about, which, spoiler, the main difference is digital preservation. So in line with the aforementioned goals, not only will I be talking about what a digital archivist is, but what digital preservation is and what it entails. And I'd also like to talk very, very briefly about the implications of archiving at large, but more specifically digital archiving on historical transparency. You may also notice that throughout this presentation, I may be using the words digital archiving or digital archivist and digital preservation and digital preservationist interchangeably. And that is because for me, digital preservation is central to digital archiving. Without digital preservation, digital archiving is ineffective. Okay. So to get started, I'd like us to take a look at some definitions of what a digital archivist is. The first one we see here is from the Society of American Archivists, or SAA for short. And they simply say that a digital archivist is an individual responsible for electronic archival resources, not too riveting or detailed, but central to this definition, though, as you can see in the notes, is that something can have historical value regardless of its format, okay? So it can be an old map or it can be an email. It has potential historical value. The next definition is from the National Archives, which is located in the UK. And it says, digital archivists work with records that are created digitally or materials that have been changed into a digital format. They use standard methods and principles to prepare both the records themselves and information about them called metadata. After this, they transfer the records and metadata into an archive or repository for long-term preservation. Metadata is a keyword here, keep it in mind. It also says it is important for the digital archivist to ensure that the records stay secure and unchanged throughout the process. So a bit more detail than the SAA definition, but what I want to point out for you is where the National Archives places emphasis in comparison to the SAA. Whereas the SAA focuses on content, right, the substance of a collection, the National Archives focuses on the integrity of the digital objects themselves, hence the use of the word record, and we'll see why later on. This dichotomy between the SAA definition and the National Archives definition is really common in the digital archiving and preservation space, where on one hand, you often have an emphasis on traditional archiving methods or elements, and on the other hand, folks tend to lean more into the computer science or coding aspects. A good digital archiving program will encompass both of these perspectives. Okay. So the SAA definition, right, while more traditional archives oriented, does make a point in highlighting that there is significant overlap between traditional archivists and digital archivists, hence the term archivist in the name, the shared term. There are four main areas to archival work: traditional or digital, and these are collection management, which entails selecting what to add to a collection, appraising items for condition, and applicability to a collection, arranging those items for retrieval, and describing those items for context and access. There's also conservation, which means keeping items in an optimal state for preservation, and storage, which is simply the arrangement of those items. And this is also tied to conservation, and that storage helps with preservation. And lastly, there is curation, which involves the sharing and displaying of items, right? So if you've ever been to Herrick, you may have seen display cases that Laurie Meehan, the university archivist, has put together. If you've been on our institutional repositories, Aura and JSOR, these are also examples of curation. So then what are the differences between a digital archivist and a traditional archivist? The first difference, which I'm sure is very obvious for everyone, is that a digital archivist works with digital files, whether born digital or digitized. So an example of a born digital file will be like a Word document, a PDF, image, video captured on your phone, or an email. Essentially, there's no portable storage medium as an intermediary to get the item. And as I'm sure you can also guess, digital files that come from being digitized will be something like a scan of a Charles Binns lecture or the transference of media from VHS tape or other digital analog format. In digital archiving work, there is an element of the physical in that I may have to handle digital analog formats and transfer materials, or I may need to at least know how to store those digital analog formats if I decide to keep them. But that really isn't the focus. Digitization, no matter how fun it is one of my favorite parts of my job, is really a means to an end, which is to get those items in a digital format. The second major difference is how digital archivists approach that conservation piece. For digital archivists, conservation is called digital preservation, and digital preservation essentially front loads conservation. This isn't to suggest that front-loading safety measures does not happen in traditional archives. It absolutely does, right? So for example, a traditional archivist may have to assess materials for what it best needs for long-term security, such as temperature or humidity levels of a space, and even considerations like if there's too much light in a particular area. However, there can be more flexibility about when you get to an item or collection and the conservation methods applied. Traditional archives are also more conducive to remediation works, right, such as fixing, book binding or treating a collection for mold and stuff like that. And digital preservation also has some emphasis on remediation. It's one of the reasons why we collect all the information we do in collections and items, which I'll touch on a bit later. But the goal is really to avoid remediation, because for digital objects, remediation is often not a guarantee. Right, you can corrupt a file and never be able to recover it. And to this end, proper storage is necessary, and the specific ways that digital archives thinks about storage differs quite a bit from the traditional archives, and we'll also look at that in a moment. Okay, so let's look at what digital preservation is. This definition is from the Digital Preservation Coalition, or DPC for short, and it says, or part of the definition says, digital preservation refers to all of the actions required to maintain access to digital materials beyond the limits of media failure and organizational change. Also keep this last bit in mind, because we will talk about it when we get to storage. Media failure is a big issue within digital preservation. It's these actions that I'd like to go over. But I also want to know, right, while digital preservation is certainly a series of steps, it is a series of steps that works best towards the best possible outcome for your particular institutional context. Digital preservation standards are really extensive, and most organizations cannot do all of them. Right, you meet these standards to the best of your ability based on the resources at your disposal. So if the Library of Congress says that TIFFs are the optimal format for preservation, but you know that for your institution storage is an issue, then you do the next best thing, which is JPEG or PNG. Okay. I want us to put on our scenario thinking hats. Okay, I'm going to read the scenario. It's 2070, and you're a new digital archivist at Alfred University. The digital archivist that started in 2024, winky face, me, has done an amazing job of setting up a preservation process, and those after have kept it up. you're looking through MFA images from 2026 and you notice that one of the JPEG files is not rendering correctly, what do you do? Right? To really test if you understand digital preservation is to be able to know what information is necessary to even begin to tackle this problem in the scenario. And as stated before, fixing the issue it presents may not always be possible, but you should absolutely have the information necessary to attempt. But before moving on to what digital preservation actually entails, I want to pause and go over what I'm going to call the atoms of the digital world. Right, because you may be asking yourself, what's so special about digital files? Why do they take so much time? Why do they need special treatment? And hopefully this portion will help explain why. And I also want to add a disclaimer that I am not a computer scientist, okay? So if any of you are and you want to correct anything I say in this section, please feel free to, okay? But essentially, every file is made up of bytes, which are made up of bits, and these can be represented in the binary, right? Those are like the 00101 stuff you see on TV shows when they want to be all techie and fun. And it can also be represented in something called the hexadecimal, which is more human readable and which we will see an example of later, okay? These bits correspond to characters on your computer, like the letter A or something. And they also tell your computer how to open a file according to the file format it is associated with, right? So what does this mean for you? And especially for me as a digital archivist and a very much not computer scientist, okay? It means that every time you manipulate a file, open it, send it, move it, whatever, the computer is essentially decoding these bytes to represent what you see. And most importantly, many errors can and often do occur during this process at the bit level. And this leads to something that digital preservation is called bit rot, okay? Digital preservation is about preventing bit rot through the collection of metadata and other actions that can help with potential remediation should it happen. So what does digital preservation actually include? And this is a bit of holistical, but it allows me to give you the breadth of what I do or potentially what I can do in any situation without bogging you all down with too much details. So the first thing is that it involves the capturing of information known as metadata, such as descriptive metadata and administrative metadata, and we will dig into that a bit later. Converting files to, or even better, collecting files in an optimal format to remove the potential for corruption or degradation to occur, right? So this looks like storing files as PDFs instead of a Word doc, saving as CSV or TSV instead of an Excel. It's also includes checking for obsolescence, since many file formats are proprietary, which means that they're owned by a corporation, and if that corporation dies, there goes that file format. Naming files appropriately, so avoiding periods or commas, for example, as separations between words in the file name. Many computers are pretty good at dealing with that these days, but because digital preservation is for the foreseeable future, we don't want to lock ourselves into only what is technologically possible now, okay? So it's still best to avoid it. Running virus scans, we don't want a virus running amok and messing up all our collections that we've worked so hard on. Using something called write blockers to ensure that new media is not added over existing media, especially in the case of working with digital analog tools. And creating checksums, which are the bread and butter of digital preservation, and I'll also talk about that a bit later, right? Being comfortable with figuring out and working with digital analog tools to remove content at risk. And also being able to work with repositories and preservation systems to manage collections and items and the information about them, that information being metadata. So what do we mean by metadata? There are many types, but for our purpose today, we're going to be looking at two, which is descriptive metadata and administrative metadata. Descriptive metadata contextualizes a collection or items in that collection for users by providing what I'm going to call narrative information on that collection or item. It's important that this stays with a collection as it moves through its life cycle, because it allows others in the future to know what that collection is about. And this might seem unnecessary, let's say, like if that collection stays within your institution, but it happens all the time that institutions move or send their collection to another institution, and it's great if those folks know what that collection is about. If you have used a library catalog, you have worked with descriptive metadata. So the image with a gray background is a record from the library's catalog. And it is about a book that is actually pretty famous in the library world called Prejudices and Antipathies. But you can see that, it has title, creator, subject, description, publisher, creation date, right? The most important fields here are subjects and description, because that is how you're able to search what you want in a database. And on the other hand, we have a descriptive metadata record for a finding aid, an aura, for the Charles Binns collection. And that one is a bit of a metadata inception because it is a record for what I just called a finding aid, which is the way that archives share contextual information about collections to researchers and users. Next is administrative metadata, and there are two types, technical and provenance. And this type of metadata is what is of most concern for digital archivists. Technical metadata captures information on the characteristics of a file format, of a file such as this format, right? In the case of digitization, does it come from a VHS, a floppy disk, etc.? It's digital format, like is it a TIFF or JPEG, location where it's stored, file name, and any other pertinent information. Okay. What this allows us to do is to decode a file in the case of remediation, and we'll look at an example in the next slide. But it also provides context as to why a file may have certain qualities, right? So, for example, there's only so much you can do in the way of video quality for a digitized VHS tape. And I'm not saying you can't do post-production stuff, but in the archive world, sometimes you just don't have time to do that, and you need to provide access to someone. And it also can provide interesting historical context, and this is something that a lot of researchers can be interested in. For example, we might get a collection, we can't really tell the date of something, but if it's, I don't know, on a lantern slide, it can give a hint as to like what time frame that thing was created, right? So it's really interesting information to capture. There is next provenance, which essentially captures any activity done to the file throughout its life cycle, such as if it was edited or moved in some way. There's something really important to this process called a checksum or fixing information. And this is essential for helping us track the stability of a file. A checksum, without getting too technical, can be described as the fingerprints of a file. It is a series of like alphanumerical string that essentially is unique to a file, but not only to that file, but to every instance of it. So if we use our Charles Binns example, right, if we have a lecture of that and we scan it in, we could generate a checksum that is unique to it. Let's say I open it and I do post-production stuff, maybe to like make it clear or whatever, and I try to generate a checksum, that checksum would be different for that file. In the digital world, that is a completely different item and it needs to be tracked separately. What this does for digital archivists is that it ensures that the file we have today is the same file we have 50 years from now, and that is important for verifying historical information and ensuring that no content is lost. And down here, we have an example of administrative metadata, specifically provenance, and you can see it shows who uploaded the file, so again, tracking who did what to it. It also shows you a checksum, the data was uploaded, and so on. Okay, so on the slide, there's a lot going on. The image in the middle is the hexadecimal that is behind the Mona Lisa image to the right. And this is an example of why collecting technical metadata can be very, very helpful. So there are instances in digital archiving where the file format associated with the file, right? So if you see like the information that's appended to the end of the file, .tiff, .jpeg, is not really accurate, and sometimes the image can't be open for whatever reason. If you're a super experienced digital archivist, you could go into a coding software and look at the hexadecimal and potentially see if what the file says it is actually what it is. So down here, you can see the hexadecimal for indicating a JPEG, the FF, D8, FFE1. Sometimes that E1 is an E0. And you can potentially like manipulate it and see if you can remediate the file. And similarly, if I went in and I changed any one of these to some random number or combination of letters, you can severely distort the image, or you can just totally corrupt it, in which case you will get this nice message from your computer telling you so. So what's important to keep in mind here is that digital archiving is concerned not only with the integrity of like a full collection, but with accounting for the integrity of every object at the file level. Even where we can't collect descriptive metadata in a moment due to processing time, the collection of administrative metadata, specifically provenance, and especially checksums if nothing else, in each file must be done. This is a bit different from traditional archives, where while some traditional archivists may go in and look at a collection and account for every single paper, image, or whatever in the collection, it's not always necessary. And actually in archival land, there's something called MPLP, which means more product, less process. And it is about contextualizing collections just enough so you can at least make them accessible to researchers without getting lost in that processing time, right? And there is an element of that in digital archives, right? I could absolutely decide to skip the script of the metadata, or do a very simplified version of it at like the full collection level rather than individual. But what I can't skip is administrative metadata, right? I have to at least have a checksum that can allow me to check the integrity of every single file. Okay. So I keep harping on about how storage is different for the digital archives in comparison to traditional archives, and we can take a look at how now. Right, digital formats are very finicky, and not just at the file level, at the bit level, but also on the medium in which they're stored, okay? This image is from the National Digital Stewardship Alliance, or NDSA for short. And as I'm sure you're picking up on, librarians and archivists love acronyms. It is honestly too much sometimes, but here we are. And I want to pay attention to the top row of storage. The storage row conforms to another principle in digital archiving called LOCKSS, which is another acronym, which means loss of copies keeps stuff safe. So you'll notice that in level 1, the barest minimum you should have is 2 copies of something stored on media that is stored in 2 separate locations. And as you go up the levels, it becomes even more complex. You not only have to think about the number of items or the number of locations, but if those if the media in those locations are in different like areas with different disaster threat types, okay? So if you have one server or something in an area that is prone to tornadoes, the second and third one should not be in an area that is prone to tornadoes, okay? Essentially for the digital archives, multiplicity is the name of the game. And this is different from the traditional archives for very obvious reasons, in that traditional archives will typically have 1 copy of an item and are confined to the physical space. And they have their own ways of thinking about security of space. But for the digital archives, the LOCKSS method is how we do it. The goal, as it says in level 4, is to maximize storage diversification to avoid a single point of failure. Many cloud storage mechanisms, Google Drive, OneDrive, Dropbox, are doing some element of this. They're storing things in different locations, thinking about disaster threats. They also generate checksums of your file. You just can't see it, right? But in the digital archives, we have systems that are more geared towards our needs, called digital preservation systems, and those are more robust in tracking this information, and they provide you as a digital archivist access to that information. Okay. And to close out, I want to talk very briefly about the larger implications of this, which is that archivists, right, at large are stewards of history, right, and we work to ensure the veracity of historical information. The digital archives existing in the internet age, ensuring collections via the internet where multiple truths often exist at once, has to take special care in this regard. So for example, recently there's a trend of folks using generative AI to experiment with historical images. And often this is for like recoloring an image if it's in black and white, or coloring an image if it's in black and white, or even like editing or fixing old family photos that are damaged, okay? And this is not the Bergren Forum where I will challenge you to think about the implications of that specifically or tell you what to think about it. But I do think it highlights the importance of the work both traditional and digital archivists do around the descriptive and technical contextualization of historical resources, right? So many digital archivists will even record as public metadata editorial changes made to a file. So let's say an image, you digitize an image and it has a specific shade of blue, and whatever process you use did not capture that. Some folks may edit the image to try and reflect that. And there's, I guess, like some interpretation built into that. And so they will record that and they will share that information with people. And on the flip side, they may decide not to do that work, in which case it will also be transparent about that. This shows that we are committed to historical transparency in all that we do. And this is really important, especially at a time where it can be hard to tell what is real from what is not. Thank you.
What questions do we have?
Thanks, Shauna-Kay. So as an archivist myself, of course, I appreciate everything you said, and I am so grateful that AU recognizes the importance of our history and heritage and the need to archive, and the digital archiving world is so completely separate from what I have done in my career, the traditional archives, as you explained it. But I'm always curious, what drew you to become a digital archives, an archivist? Because in many ways it's everybody needs one, right? But we don't think about it. So I'd love to hear you just a little bit explain what drew you to the concept of digital archiving to begin with.
Yeah. So I went to library school specifically for like academic libraries and became interested in the archives. But I went to the University of Michigan, and as a part of that, they force you to take a Python class. And they also force you to take a class that's not necessarily on cataloging, but about thinking about like classification systems as a whole and their implications. And the professor that taught the second one was extremely technical, and he was really good at showing how Python or other coding tools could help with the latter, which is about thinking about classification. So essentially, even though I was more like, I've always been more historically focused, I think being at the University of Michigan, I was exposed to like more technical heavy skills, and I found that I really, really liked it. And I wanted to be in a role that could combine both of those things, where I could explore historical collections, but I could also use those technical skills I learned. Yeah.
As I look around, I have a question also.
Yeah.
In that, am I correct in understanding how that checksum works, in that would allow you or any other digital archivist to be able to tell if a file has been altered? Because one of the things that strikes me about digital archives is that a hacker could far more easily alter those files than they can, say, something that Lori has behind a great big thick pane of glass that Jonathan Allen or Abigail Allen wrote, so that the checksum would help prevent that?
Yes, at a glance. And you can do it, you can check it manually through like creating a code that compares it. But a lot of digital preservations do that. Digital preservation systems do that for you, where they periodically run a check to make sure that the checksum they generate is the same as what you have, and they'll like give you a report. So it's very easy to tell at a glance without checking every single document. Yeah.
And then presumably some sort of other backup in some sort of super secure, totally not on the cloud location would be necessary to restore any altered files.
Some places, if they have the means, will have a local copy of that. Most places can't, so it is usually still on the cloud via like a distribution of servers. But part of like how the lock system works is that technically these servers are always like, I guess, verifying amongst each other, right? So if like there's 3 servers and one is like, this checksum is a little weird, it might default to whatever version the other 2 copies have. So that's one of the reasons why having multiple servers in your process is important. Yeah.
Cool.
So a lot of your presentation was focused rightfully on individual files. But I think you could also maybe, since we have time, maybe give the audience a little more flavor. I mean, there's more that you're doing as a digital archivist, so like web archiving. And so the digital archivist is very expansive in roles and responsibilities and things to think about. So I don't know if you feel comfortable wanting to highlight just a couple more areas of things that you're thinking about and working on.
Yeah. So web archiving is one of them. I am in the process of setting up, well, it's already set up, but it's not complete. A web archiving for us where folks can look at the Archive AU webpage, or perhaps like sometimes folks do web-based scholarship. And so this is a way for us to capture that information. Another goal I want to potentially have is a sort of like exhibitionary page where it's not just on Aura JSTOR, here is a list of things in our collections, but perhaps a page where it provides context to that collection, so more exhibitionary in that sense. And a very sweet dream I have for the Digital Preservation Lab in schools is to perhaps have a space where folks can actually interact with digital analog material. Even if like a lot of those materials are digitized, I think it would be cool for people to be able to, I don't know, interact with like a macrophage or like look at a slide in the lab and stuff like that. Yeah.
So this may be a little off topic, but I'm wondering about 2 things. One is, do you have any exposure to, or is this anyhow related to digital NFTs? That's what I was thinking about. And then the second piece of it is, I'm curious to what extent then does what you're doing, how does it interact or interface or get related to the large language models in artificial intelligence?
Yeah. So what I do does not overlap at all with like NFTs or anything. Where my role can overlap with like generative AI tools is, let's say, I don't know, I need to write a code to quickly manipulate like a large amount of like file names or something. Generative AI could help me do that more quickly. It could also potentially do things like create alt text for a large amount of images. Right now, it's not always good at that, but it could. So the ways in which generative AI would work is more so with like speeding up certain like technical parts of the workflow. Yeah. But I don't really have anything to do with like the creation of LLMs or anything. There are some larger archives or like digital preservation labs, because they're part of like big universities, that will experiment with creating a generative chatbot that only works with like historical information. I think there's a university out of the UK that just made something like that. But in my role at AU, that's not really what I would do. Yeah.
Is your digital archive exposed to artificial?
No. And I'm thinking about it more, but I would prefer it not to be, because I feel like that has larger implications for like training data and stuff like that. And also because it can often lead to the decontextualization of files and items, and I do not want to do that. Part of what we collect in the digital archives is also student work. So I would never upload I would not upload MFA images to generative AI to do anything, not even alt text. Yeah.
Do you have a room of equipment with like a reel-to-reel and a projector and the microfiche readers and all of the older things that we are no longer using, so you can actually work with the materials that you have?
We have some things in storage. And I'm working on getting other things so that we do have those items for if whenever we get any sort of media that we need to work with. Yeah.
We do have a microfiche reader at Herrick Library.
There we go.
We're looking for one, honestly. We've used them too much already.
Anything else? Please join me in thanking Shauna-Kay again.